Today, we present another exciting installment in this amendment series with author and historian Garrett Peck, who's going to guide us through the Prohibition era and its cultural and economic impact on American society. Starting with the 18th Amendment's ratification in 1919, initially supported by the temperance movement as a solution to broader societal issues, we'll explore how Prohibition gave rise to illicit alcohol trades such as rum running, bootlegging, and moonshining. This also transformed local street gangs into organized crime syndicates with such notable, infamous figures as Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and more. This dramatically shifted the public's perception of the nationwide ban on alcohol. This changing perception, this significant shift in public opinion is what eventually led to the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed the prohibition of alcohol that went through in the 18th Amendment in 1933. This was the first and to date only repeal of a constitutional amendment, and I'm sure we're going to get into that further. But let me tell you more about our excellent speaker and a longtime friend of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. Garrett Peck played a pivotal role in making the Rickey the official cocktail of Washington, D.C. in 2011. He's going to draw on insights from his book, Prohibition in Washington, D.C., How Dry We Weren't, and he'll share compelling stories about the hidden history of speakeasies, bootleggers, George Cassiday, the congressional bootlegger who inspired Green Hat Gin, and some of the jazz-infused nightlife stories of U Street and other parts of Washington, D.C. Garrett is an author, historian, and tour guide in Santa Fe, where he specializes in adventure travel and historic and cultural interpretation. He leads the Willa Cather Santa Fe tour, among other activities out there in the American Southwest. He's the author of 8 books about American history, with his latest being A Decade of Disruption, America and the New Millennium. He's currently working on a book about how Willa Cather wrote her best book, in her own words, Death Comes for the Archbishop. He's lectured for the Library of Congress, the National Archives, Smithsonian Associates, and literary clubs. A native of California, he graduated from the venerable Virginia Military Institute and George Washington University. He's an Army veteran, and again, he's a friend of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. Please join me in welcoming Garrett Peck to share with us about Prohibition in Washington, D.C. Garrett.
Thank you, Samuel, and thank you everyone for your support here for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. I'm Garrett Peck, and I used to live in D.C. In fact, I lived in Arlington for 27 years, and then 3 years ago, I moved out to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is my final destination. I just absolutely love it out here. So I miss lots about D.C., however, not the humidity. Oof, man. So here we have the opposite problem because it's so dry. So in any case, really glad to be able to connect with everyone here today. I've got a really fun presentation about definitely not a dry topic, no pun intended, actually pun intended, which is about the Prohibition amendments. Let me bring up my screen here real quickly and share that with you. I've got an amazing deck of slides here. Almost every one of the photos comes from the Prints and Photographs division of the Library of Congress, which is a tremendous resource. They've got all these different images archived. Today, you get copyright for 95 years, and then it goes into the public domain. So LC has this incredible collection here of photographs from the Prohibition era, which is really pretty incredible. This very first one, of course, it's a very famous photograph of John Leach, the New York City Assistant Police Commissioner, watching beer being poured down the drain in New York City. So, as a beer drinker, that's a very, very tragic photograph right there. But I want to talk about here with you today about how Prohibition came to be, why we changed the Constitution, and then why it failed and we had to unwind the whole thing after less than 14 years. It's a pretty incredible tale. And as Samuel said, it's the only constitutional amendment we've ever repealed. It's a pretty fascinating story. It begins here with this photograph I took a number of years ago in the Library of Congress, in the Adams Building, where they have all these amazing murals out there. It starts with the Temperance movement. This was a social reform movement that got going in the 1820s. As the country was going on this huge whiskey binge, which was mostly men drinking and drinking themselves to death and spending up all their wages and whatnot. And as a logical outcome from that, the Protestant churches, especially in New England, got together and said, look, we've got a problem. We need to address the fact that so many American men are drinking themselves to death. And they came up with this movement, temperance. Initially, the idea meant to temper, as in to moderate one's drinking. But by the 1830s, more radicals had taken charge of the movement and decided that there was no safe level that for anyone to be able to drink alcohol at all, and therefore temperance became associated with abstinence from alcohol. And that's what, for example, you see that mythical figure on the left-hand side, and she's pouring, typically in the Greco-Roman world, she'd be pouring out wine, but instead here, she's pouring out water. So there's this big messaging around, drink water instead of whiskey and so on. So it's remarkable. This movement was largely overshadowed by the sectional crisis over slavery, which led to the Civil War. And then by the 1870s, with that out of the way, now a number of different organizations popped up. For example, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And by the way, let me back up real quickly here and talk about how much the temperance movement here propagandized using terms, for example, like John Barleycorn and demon rum, and they really made alcohol into some kind of great sin against God, and therefore, because this wasn't a white Protestant evangelical movement. So you see here in 1872, a propaganda poster showing King Alcohol and his prime minister. The king here in the very, very center, and then the prime minister is death. So that's the whole message they're trying to impart here. Once you start drinking, you are on the slippery slope to becoming a quote drunkard, their word for back then for an alcoholic. So in fact, most people don't become alcoholics, but some do, but most don't. But in their scheme, though, no one should drink alcohol, which is why they wanted to ban alcohol entirely. This is a picture here from Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol. This is Frances Willard, who led a really remarkable woman who for nearly 20 years led the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And if you ever get to Evanston, Illinois, go visit her house. It's really a phenomenal place. It's the House Museum. And this woman had her fingers in everything. It was incredible. She was such an activist for women's rights. And then she allied together with the suffrage movement, which is how you got these two amendments basically passed in 1919 and 1920, because there was this alliance to get women the vote and also ban alcohol. The WCTU itself formed in 1874, and at its peak had about 600,000 members. That said, women could not vote. And so what they tried to do was influence people through education and whatnot, not to drink. And especially for Protestants, this became a huge, huge issue. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was born in 1913. And throughout her adult life, she insisted that she did not drink. And in part, that's because she grew up here with the WCTU's educational programs, which was taught to shame people about alcohol. And after she died in 2007, we found deep in her kitchen her liquor cupboard. So it was sort of taught to this generation, to be ashamed of drinking. And therefore, if you do drink, drink at home, drink away from other people. Don't let anyone see you actually drinking. You get to the greatest generation, as we call it, the World War II generation. And from then on, drinking has just become normalized in our society. But it's just kind of remarkable how much the WCTU worked to stigmatize the social environment around drinking alcohol. And that stuck with us until the 1950s, really. Another key organization, this is the organization that gave us prohibition, and the 18th Amendment, I should say, and that is the Anti-Saloon League. It began in the 1890s in Ohio by a man named William Howard, William, I'm forgetting his name here all of a sudden, William Russell Hyde. And he's the one who came up with this idea of we need to have a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol entirely, because moral suasion alone is not going to do it. We need the power of the law to force people to stop drinking. So the ASL was founded in 1893, had its first national convention in DC in 1895. And one of its first hires was a young man fresh out of Oberlin College named Wayne Wheeler. This man you've probably not heard of, or he's largely forgotten to history, but probably the most powerful individual lobbyist in American history. This man terrified all of Congress. And he's the one who basically pushed through the 18th Amendment. And he came up with the term pressure politics. So it's all about using our minority power to leverage its power over all the other politicians to force them to vote dry, even if they're wet in their personal lives. So everyone was terrified of Wayne Wheeler because every politician's first job is to get reelected. And he would promise you, if you bucked him on the question of prohibition, he would ensure that you had a primary challenger and you would not get reelected. So, and he was pretty much good for his word on that one. So, and he was very bipartisan about this. He worked with Republicans and Democrats. It was all about getting all the politicians to force them to vote dry. So, and again, this is a minority power, but they have a lot of power. They're very outspoken and they push through the issue. We're going to talk about one or really two key amendments here today, but just kind of want to lay out here for the period of that 20, 25 years or so known as the Progressive Era. We have four constitutional amendments during this period. It's pretty incredible. We tend to think of the dry cause as being conservative, but that's actually not the case. This was about using the power of the law to improve Americans' lives. So we got a number of different things here. The income tax comes about in 1913. And that's important for the prohibitionist movement, the temperance movement, because the federal government is highly dependent upon alcohol excise taxes to fund itself. And so once that's in place, now we have an alternative here to fund, so we can get rid of alcohol, that the US government can still be able to fund itself. That same year, we had the direct election of US senators, which was considered beforehand very corrupt because the representatives of the state legislatures had chosen who the senators were going to be. So now the citizens, us, now elect our senators. We have in 1919, which goes into effect a year later, the 18th Amendment, our key amendment we're going to talk about today. And then, of course, in 1920, the last of the Progressive Era amendments, which gives women the right to vote. We have in 1914, once the the income tax amendment has been put forward and is now law. The temperance movement pushes forward the 18th Amendment for the very first time in 1914, and it comes so close to succeeding. People are just absolutely stunned by this. The power of the Anti-Saloon League is so extreme at this point. And even though they don't win, but they're like, okay, we are so close to our goal. We're going to try again in a few years. And what happens in 1917? A crucial thing happens. We declare war on April 6, 1917, against Germany, and the United States enters World War I. And this is now the Anti-Saloon League's big opportunity. They push forward the 18th Amendment, and they use a great deal of propaganda to spin beer drinking into treason. Our main enemy in the war, of course, is Germany. Our largest ethnic minority in the country at the time were German Americans. And guess who the brewers were? German Americans, right? So you see very quickly how they spin the wheels on this to basically push the public into, we need to save grain to have sober soldiers, so we can defeat the vaunted German army during the war. This is all propaganda, of course. The Germans themselves give beer to their soldiers. The British give gin and other kinds of alcohol to their soldiers. The French, of course, give brandy and champagne and wine to their soldiers as part of the rations. So, but for us, we're entering this world war. We got to have sober soldiers, and we need to save that grain so we can feed our army and feed the world here during the war. Again, it's all part of the propaganda machine of the war. Here's probably the most famous propaganda poster in American history. I want you for U.S. Army, right? So again, the Anti-Saloon League very effectively wound up its propaganda machine to convince Americans to support the dry cause. World War I is, without a doubt, the most idealistic war we ever got involved in. Just incredible. Woodrow Wilson, of course, framed it as a war to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. And so we had all this idealism going into this of how we were going to go end all wars, make this the very, very last war, and we're going to build a global solution. So through the League of Nations that will ensure that wars don't break out again. It's an incredible amount of idealism. We're only in the war for 19 months. It's just incredible. And then the whole thing then shatters upon the peace treaty with a very huge and very ugly partisan fight over the Treaty of Versailles. And then we never ratified the treaty. And thus we never entered the League of Nations, which really hobbled the League entirely. But during this time here, during the war itself, the Anti-Saloon League got Congress to push forward the 18th Amendment, and it sailed through all the state houses. The majority of states, you needed, of course, 3/4 of the states to ratify the amendment. Almost all the states ratified the amendment during the war, which is really incredible. It was just part of this hyper patriotism that was going on, what we call super patriotism, of like, yeah, we got to win this war. We got to save grain. We need prohibition. no one was thinking in terms of the consequences of, gee, how do we enforce this thing once you ban alcohol entirely from the nation? It's pretty remarkable. But a war is going on, and no one really quite thinks about the consequences and the outcome of this until really it's too late. The 18th Amendment itself, here's the wording here of the amendment. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the quote, manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors, blah, 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 is hereby prohibited. So it gave everyone 1 year warning from when it was ratified. The state that ratified that, by the way, on January 16th, 1919, the 36th state was my dad's home state of Nebraska. That's the state that ratified it. And eventually, almost every state other than two ratified the amendment. The two that didn't were heavily Catholic and heavily urban. And those states were Connecticut and Rhode Island. But otherwise, 46 of the 48 states ratified the 18th Amendment. It was just the national will because of the war. Everyone thought we needed to go do this. And but it took 13 months basically to ratify this thing. And we'll talk about later on how quickly it took to ratify the 21st Amendment to undo this whole thing, which is really astonishing. We also had a law passed called the Volstead Act, and named after the congressman in the House Judiciary Committee, who's the chair of it, a Minnesota Republican named Andrew Volstead. And yeah, he had a very impressive Ned Flanders mustache here. But he was soon ousted from Congress because of the Volstead Act. This was how they defined what was an intoxicating liquor. And Wayne Wheeler was heavily involved in getting the Volstead Act passed and in inscribing what it was going to be. And Americans were really stunned by the extremism of this law. Most Americans thought we were simply outlawing liquor, that is to say, distilled spirits. However, by the definition under the Volstead Act, anything intoxicating at all, which included beer, anything above 0.5% was considered intoxicating. That'd be a lot of beer to drink. So they basically outlawed all alcohol entirely. And that really stunned most Americans. It's one of the reasons why Volstead got ousted here at the next election, because he had a huge target on him. Most Americans, like I said, were very stunned at the extreme position that the Anti-Saloon League had taken. And Wayne Wheeler was like, yeah, we understand this, but it's just going to take a couple of years to get Americans to accept this. We'll have a big education effort and so on. But that is not how things worked out at all. President Wilson, by the way, vetoed the Volstead Act. And the very next day, this is October of 1919, and the very next day, Congress overrode his veto, just showing you the power of the Wayne Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League. Prohibition begins 1 year after Nebraska ratified the 18th Amendment. And I think this is a very clever photo here. This is of Congressman William Upshaw from Georgia, one of the very few actually dry congressmen. And I think this is a clever photo. We use this on the cover of my book, Prohibition in Washington, D.C. He's symbolically holding an umbrella over the Capitol, signifying we are now dry. So pretty clever. But most congressmen drank, as we will find out from George Cassidy when we get to his story. So we have to ask ourselves, of course, we ban alcohol, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, but by the way, not personal possession. The Anti-Saloon League was smart enough to know that most Americans would really object to that. But they thought very naively that most Americans would simply drink up what they had at home and then they would go dry, not realizing that there would be bootleggers who would show up right away. So we do have to ask this question: did in fact a national consensus exist? It's very hard to change our Constitution. We only have, 27 amendments? So the framers made it very difficult. You have to get 2/3 of Congress to ratify it. And then on top of that, you've got to get 3/4 of the states to ratify it. That's why we have so many amendments, because you have to have a national consensus around these questions. In this case here, the consensus was around the war. And yeah, we got to win the war. Yeah, and I think that's really where the loophole is, or the blind spot is, I should say. And of course, our big question for today: why did Prohibition fail? And largely because of the public and the public's refusal to to accept prohibition. I look at prohibition really from an econ 101 standpoint. What the 18th Amendment did was to deny the supply side. They were addressing the supply side of the equation, the manufacture, transportation, and sale, but without addressing the demand side of the equation. Remember when you were in college and you had to take econ 101 and you had these two bars, right? Supply and demand. And you can take away the supply, but if that demand is still there, in other words, if consumers still want to drink and are willing to pay for it, someone is going to meet that supply. And that's what bootleggers do very quickly. So you start seeing right away, and when prohibition begins, there's so much money to be made, and so much of it, all of it, is untaxed because it's all illegal. So right away, the bootleggers are like, look at all the money we can make. And basically what it does, it rolls out the red carpet for organized crime. In DC proper, in case you're in that city, there was never a major organized crime syndicate or anything like that. It was really open to everyone. And so you had thousands of people who got involved in bootlegging. It's just really, really fascinating. So here's a photograph showing early on in Prohibition. I love this label. The largest still in captivity. I think this is from 1921 or 1922. They would find much larger stills later on. But I mean, most of the parts for a still you could buy at a hardware store. You could make it distilled spirits in your house. And we get that term bathtub gin from you then going to your bathtub and cutting that distilled spirit because it's nearly 100% alcohol. You then cut it with water using the bathtub spigot. So you're not actually making the spirits in your bathtub. But distilled spirits are so profitable, and you can cut it enormously with water, which makes a vast amount of quantity of liquor. And that's why the bootleggers are focusing on distilled spirits during Prohibition, because it's so profitable for them. Here's another cool photo showing a raid at the Carl Hemmel buffet lunch. He's a German immigrant, and the site of this here, and by the way, he had a very classic for a speakeasy, a legitimate business up front. So he had a lunchroom, and then he had a little dark room in the back where customers who were in the know could say like, "Hey, I want to go back and get a beer." And he was a German, so he would serve beer back there. So you see, they're pulling all the beer barrels out there. They raided this place 3 different times. The site of this today, very ironically, is the site of the Department of Justice in the Federal Triangle. So I think that's so funny and apropos. So Sinclair Lewis, who's one of the great American satirists, especially of the early 20th century, he nailed in 1922 why Prohibition was destined to fail. And he wrote this book, by the way, it's called Babbitt, and he's satirizing Midwestern values of uplift and conformity and so on. And he has this scene where sort of the anti-hero, George Babbitt, was riding on a train with a number of other men, and they get to debating Prohibition. And this one guy, you don't know his name, but he makes this incredible statement when he says, "I don't know how you fellows feel about prohibition, but the way it strikes me is that it is a mighty beneficial thing for the poor zob that hasn't got any willpower. But for fellows like us, it's an infringement of personal liberty." It's really incredible, that statement right there. This is, again, 2 years into national prohibition, and Sinclair Lewis has nailed why it's going to fail. Prohibition is for other people to obey, but not me. I'm not going to obey that. I can handle my alcohol, and I've got a good relationship with my bootlegger, and you can't make me. So I'm going to keep drinking. But those other people, by the way, the word zob, someone pointed out to me, that was Sinclair Lewis's way of disguising the phrase SOB. Censors might have taken that out, so he replaced, son of a bitch, or SOB with zob, and that way it sounded more like legitimate and, etc. But it's just kind of incredible. He nailed why prohibition socially was destined to fail, because everyone was disobeying the law of the land. They thought it was for other people to obey, but not me. And that's not how laws work. We all have to work together to obey them to ensure that they do work. In 1924, this is hilarious. There is a national contest sponsored by a man named Delsevier King. He's a Harvard alumnus, and he's so upset at seeing the law breaking going on at his alma mater. So in January of 1924, on the 4th anniversary of the beginning of Prohibition, he sponsors a national contest to come up with a word to name and shame those lawbreakers. The prize is $200 in gold, which is pretty significant in 1924. It's a century ago. And they make a bunch of suggestions about, hey, the word should be two syllables, should start with the letter S. And there's a woman from Quincy, sorry, from Dorchester, Massachusetts, eastern Boston, submits the word. This is a brilliant word. The word is scofflaw, invented in January of 1924, 100 years ago, a couple months ago. Scofflaw, someone who scoffs at the law, right? It's an ingenious word. Uh, Within days, in Maxim's bar in Paris, where a bunch of American expatriate bartenders are now working, they get together and they come up with a scofflaw cocktail to basically satirize Prohibition. And it is one of my all-time favorite cocktails. It is absolutely delicious. The secret ingredient in this is grenadine. And you can make your own grenadine very, very easily. Get that Palm Wonderful stuff, and then you mix it 50-50 with simple syrup. And that's what grenadine is. So it's based off of pomegranate juice. And it's bright pink, like a cosmopolitan, but it tastes much, much different. And raise your glass, then you can kind of celebrate these bartenders in 1924 who wanted to satirize Prohibition. And they did it in very, very fine style. You continue on here, another very tragic photo here showing interception here from out of a Philadelphia brewery, which it was making real beer, and the judge in the case then ordered all this beer to be destroyed in the Arlington, Virginia dump, which is today one of the parking lots surrounding the Pentagon. So there's all these, thousands of beer bottles that are there under one of the parking lots that are there. But this is such a tragic photo. I'm just like, oh no, as a beer drinker, like watching them shatter each bottle one by one in the dump. It's just kind of incredible. H.L. Mencken, who is an atheist and very much opposed to the temperance movement, and he writes very scathingly of them. He calls Prohibition afterwards the, quote, 13 awful years, which I think is so funny. He had such a sharp wit and, and a kind of a barbed tongue about people and about social movements, etc. So he was very, very libertarian and very, very touted here, these social reform movements and so on. But his stories about Prohibition were absolutely hilarious. So he called bootleggers booticians. And he very quickly discovered he could go to ships that were docked in Hoboken and New York Harbor. These European ships still had alcohol on them. They were allowed to carry it. And so he could go on one of these ships where he established relations with the different porters and whatnot. And he could go there and drink. And of course, living in New York City and Baltimore, going back and forth between the two places, he quickly discovered that there was no such thing as prohibition. Like everyone was still drinking and it was easy to get. In 1929, he wrote this hilarious article skewering the leading church, the Methodist Church, which is the leading church of the temperance movement at the time. And I'm kind of a former Methodist myself. He wrote this article called Hot Dogs. And in it, he said, basically, it's sort of making peace with the fact of, hey, we have to make do with what we have. Whether it's bootleg beer or bootleg alcohol and so on. And he advised to everyone, let us, while waiting for the end of the Methodist Millennium, I think that is so funny, Methodist Millennium, do the best we can. Let us keep on improving the sandwich and let us give some attention to the dog. The sandwich and the dog are a metaphor for the bootleg liquor that we have to deal with. In other words, we got to make do with what we have, right? So hence the hot dog metaphor. He's really referring to bootlegged alcohol. It's quite funny. That's 1929 when he pens this article. At this point, the American public had become quite cynical about prohibition because they see the law breaking going on all around them. And of course, what happens on February 14th, Valentine's Day, makes national news in the United States. You all know this. Almost every audience can go, yeah, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And that just was so emblematic of the law breaking. And also now the different mob organizations are engaging in turf wars over who gets to control alcohol distribution. And in this case here, Al Capone and his gang basically wipes out the O'Banion game in Chicago. You've all seen movies or read articles, read books about this. It's where his gang, captured the O'Banions and lined them up in a garage and machine gunned them all to death. 7 people died. Just absolutely incredible. And if you've ever seen, I think one of the greatest comedy movies in American history, the movie Some Like It Hot with Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe and Jack Lemmon and his they have to go and drag because they are eyewitnesses to this massacre, and and so they're trying to flee the mob, and it's absolutely hysterical. And Jack Lemmon, especially, obviously loves being in drag in this movie. But go back and watch it; it is a really, really great movie. But it starts off with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. And that, again, that became so emblematic for the country of what was going wrong with prohibition in the country, that, prohibition did not prohibit. And instead, now we're seeing organized crime killing people over turf and so on. So that was a huge eye opener for a lot of Americans. And then, of course, what happens later that year in October? I should hear a collective, the stock market collapsed. Exactly. That's what happens. And the Great Depression has its onset. During Prohibition, I should backing up a little bit. Prohibition had passed, the 18th Amendment had passed, and the Volstead Act as well, as a bipartisan measure. Republicans and Democrats had both supported the amendment. However, the 1920s belonged very solidly to the Republican Party. We had 3 Republican presidents, and also both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans. And so then it was up to the Republicans to enforce prohibition, which they couldn't do, despite putting all this funding into enforcement, but it was never enough. And Americans continued to break the law. And then you get to the Great Depression. And because of the Great Depression, the Democrats seized upon this issue and they're like, prohibition's unpopular. We want to get back in power. Let's embrace repeal. The repeal of prohibition. And in fact, when prohibition went into effect, we lost about 250,000 jobs. And the Democrats seize upon this issue, like, hey, if we can end prohibition, wouldn't it be great to have those jobs back? 250,000 jobs at the peak of the Great Depression, or the lowest point of the Great Depression, I should say, in 1933. The economy had contracted by 1/3, and 1/4 of the American workforce was out of work. It's the worst financial crisis of our nation's history. And just kept going on and on. Between 1929 and 1933, when Roosevelt was elected, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. It really was a financial catastrophe. And so the Democrats seized upon this issue of ending prohibition, and let's target how we are going to direct this national effort to ending the Great Depression and so on. And this is why the 1930s then is dominated by the Democratic Party. So the big issue of the 30s is the Great Depression, but a subset of that is prohibition, and in part ending the lawlessness of prohibition, and also re-legalizing alcohol so we can tax it as well. So that's all part of the Democrats' promise here to the nation if we repeal prohibition. In September of 1930, one of the great progressives of Congress is Senator Morris Shepherd of Texas. And he was the one who made DC dry, and he is one of the authors of the 18th Amendment. And as this rising volume of people are calling for the end of the 18th Amendment, and Shepherd is like, laying out the gauntlet here. And he's basically saying, we are not going to change, we're not going to amend the Constitution or change or repeal the 18th Amendment. And he makes this very famous statement, which is pretty incredible. He says in September of 1930, there is as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to the planet Mars with the Washington Monument tied to its tail. Oh boy, right? I mean, that rolled out the gauntlet here to the wet cause, which was ready to go deal with its own propaganda here at this point. And boy, howdy, did they strike back at Senator Shepherd over this statement here. First off, you have a man named a World War I era infantry captain and an Irishman named Rufus Lusk. And I got this photo here from his grandson, Rufus Lusk III, who himself was a minister. Lusk, for those of you who lived in DC back like the 80s and 90s, you might recall the Lusk real estate papers. This guy was a data guy, and he loved assembling data about real estate transactions and so on. And he had the great idea of, let us embarrass the dry cause. And he was a wet himself. Let's embarrass the dry cause by taking all the police data from all the different raids and in DC and placing them on a map, and then publicized it. He did this twice. So once in 1930 and the second time in 1932. And I found the 1932 one in the Library of Congress, and I'll show you that map, which is it's pretty incredible. But when they published the first one, oh my gosh, it went global. I mean, it was in worldwide newspapers, and this was based off of 7 months of police data. And it would really show that DC was not a model dry city, that there was bootlegging going on in the halls of Congress and so on. So it's kind of an incredible story. Here is the speakeasy map, as he called it. This is a really powerful propaganda tool. This is the one from 1932, based off of an entire year's worth of police data, and it shows 1,155 speakeasy raids where they found alcohol. And here it is. Look at this. Dots mark the spot where booze has been bought. It even rhymes. Look at all those dots. It's just absolutely incredible. And on there, you'll see all the different stars. Those are federal offices where raids took place. And very effectively, Rufus Lusk put on this map here. He put the offices of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Congress, the Methodist Building, the Supreme Court, and the Anti-Saloon League offices. And of course, they're all surrounded by dots, just showing you there were raids everywhere. It's just just absolutely incredible how much the public was breaking the law. And of course, this became national news here as well. So just absolutely incredible propaganda tool. The following month, after Rufus Lusk published his first speakeasy map, out came an incredible scoop here by the Washington Post, which at that time, it was a small, the big newspaper in DC was the Herald. Sorry, not the Herald, but the Evening Star, the Washington Star. And the Washington Post was still a smaller newspaper, a little more of a gossip rag, but they got this incredible scoop from a man named George Cassidy. By the way, I forget to put this one up here. This is a woman here who's one of the Crusaders, and showing here the effort behind the public here to repeal the 18th Amendment. Moving on here to George Cassidy. This is him. And in October of 1930, after he was arrested for the second time for bootlegging for Congress, he penned 6 front-page articles for the Washington Post. This is absolutely an incredible scoop. One of its first great scoops, later on, of course, to get Watergate and so on, the Pentagon Papers. But the final one of these articles was published a week before the midterm election. Just amazing. And he spilled the beans on Congress. So he had bootlegged for Congress for 10 years. And he had estimated during this time that 8 out of 10 congressmen drank alcohol, because he knew them all by first name, because they would come to him. When he worked for the first 5 years on the House side, they gave him an office in the basement of the now Cannon House office building. And then after he was arrested in 1925, had a very short prison sentence, and then he reopened shop in the Russell Senate office building. Senators were more discreet. They would send their secretaries down to go to get more library materials, many of them would call it. But just incredible. So all these congressmen are all being incredibly hypocritical, because they're all making speeches. They're voting in favor of prohibition because they're all in terror of Wayne Wheeler, who, by the way, died in 1927. But meanwhile, they're all drinking. It's just kind of amazing, So he became known as the man in the green hat. You see his green hat there in the background, that fedora that he wore. And he got that from when he was arrested in 1925. There was a reporter looking over like, hey, what's going over there? Who's that guy getting arrested? And someone said, oh, that guy in the green hat, that's George Cassidy. So the nickname stuck. So they used that throughout the Washington Post articles, the man in the green hat. That had a huge impact, of course, not just locally on DC, but nationally. The story just showed the hypocrisy of Congress for drinking during Prohibition. You also had other organizations that popped up. For example, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, or kind of a weird acronym, WANPR. But they were really a counterweight to the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were basically saying, WCTU was claiming, we speak for women, and WANPR was saying, no, you don't. We also speak for women, and what women want is repeal. And very, very effective organization, because remember as well, women can vote now. They couldn't for the 18th Amendment, but they could here for repeal. So women overwhelmingly supported the repeal of prohibition, and that's a major part of it. And WANPR was so successful because they got women at every class level. It started off with Mrs. Sabine Morton from the Morton Salt family. And then they opened up all these chapters all around the country and got working class women involved and so on. This is really a cross-class women's movement to end prohibition. It was very, very effective. So as we see here, the idealism of having this sober, dry nation shattered on a hard reality between all the bootlegging that was going on, organized crime, and then of course the Great Depression, which undid it all. So it's a remarkable story. The Democrats pushed forward the 21st Amendment in January of 1933. So Franklin Roosevelt is the last president to be sworn in on March 4th. Congress debates and passes the 18th Amendment, sorry, the 21st Amendment by February of 1933 and goes on to the states for ratification. Just absolutely incredible how fast they did it. But the Democrats now control Congress, and they wanted this thing here passed through. So just remarkable. Here is Franklin Roosevelt being on his way to being sworn in. He's the last president to be sworn in on March 4th, 1933. That's another key thing here because of the Great Depression. We used to have this 4-month interregnum period between the election and then swearing in. That was great in 1796 or whenever, because it took a long time for the presidents to be able to get to the nation's capital. But given that you had a 4-month period, lame duck period where this national economic crisis is going on, people were like, oh, wow, we really need to shorten this up. We need to get a new executive in, and which is how, as well, then we get the 20th Amendment. So that's very important here for us. And that's how these are the two Great Depression era constitutional amendments. First, the 20th Amendment, which goes into effect in 1936. That way when Roosevelt is sworn in for the second time. He's sworn in now on January 20th, and every president since then has been. And then, of course, the 21st Amendment, which is ratified on December 5th, 1933. This is incredible. It only took 8 months to ratify this amendment. This was really showed you there was a national consensus to end prohibition. And so the first state that ratifies it was on April 10th, the very excellent beer state of Michigan, where my stepmother is from. Michigan becomes the very first state, and the Democrats control the state houses now. So they just start lining up all their conventions one by one by one by one. And that's how we get this amendment ratified in 8 months. Keeping in mind the 13th Amendment took 13 months. This here is really where the national consensus is. People want the end of prohibition. And so here you see the wording of it here real quickly here. There's 3 different clauses. I just put 2 up here. The third one, by the way, gives it 7 years to ratify. And in fact, it's like I said, it's ratified in 8 months. Excuse me. The 18th Amendment is the first one. It's simply saying it's hereby repealed. And then number 2 is really important for us as well, because it's basically giving the states the ability to regulate alcohol within their borders. So you've got a number of dry states that remain dry afterwards, like Kansas and Oklahoma and so on. The very last state to go wet was Mississippi in 1966, and it had a profound bootlegging culture. What someone from Mississippi once told me was a, quote, backdoor culture, because the bootleggers would come to your back door to make their deliveries. So, and then finally the state was like, we should just legalize it because, people are still drinking regardless, So the second clause here of the 21st Amendment is really important. That allows people like, for example, in Utah, to basically say, look, I did not vote in favor of alcohol, but rather I voted in favor of control. And now we are going to control this beast. So that's their way of going back to their constituents and saying, like, look, prohibition is not working. We need to get this beast back under control. And this is how we're going to do it here through the second clause here, by states having control over alcohol being imported into their borders. Prohibition ends on December 5th, 1933. 3 states line up on that day to ratify the constitutional amendment, 2 eastern states and 1 western state. That western state sees that the first one has ratified the amendments, and they want to be the one that puts it over the top. So they actually, during that day, all the delegates are there at their state capital, and they agree to meet earlier in the day. That way they can be the one to put it over the top. And this is an incredible story. This is the state of Utah. Yes, Utah, where 70% of the people are Mormon and do not drink alcohol. Even the Mormons were for prohibition. And the delegates were like, yeah, we're going to ratify this amendment. And so Utah became the state on December 5th, 1933 to end prohibition because they ratified the 21st Amendment. Many of us after this refer to December 5th as Repeal Day, and also in some quarters referred to as Cinco de Drinko. So, but that is the end of the 18th Amendment here on December 5th, 1933. So that's how it all comes to an end. So, and we've got plenty of time here for Q&A. Just have a couple final slides I want to show you here. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I moved out here from DC, and yes, I also have a Prohibition in Santa Fe tour, and kind of my follow-on book here. After the next one, which I'm going to tell you about here in a second, is about Prohibition in New Mexico. I mean, you could write a book about any city in any small town. There's going to be a Prohibition story. The law breaking was just endemic, and it was everywhere. So here in Santa Fe, in addition to Prohibition, I lead a tour called the Willa Cather Tour. That is specifically about a book that she wrote in 1927 called Death Comes for the Archbishop. And Cather herself was a drinker. I found an incredible letter from 1924 asking a friend of hers to cancel the order of gin because a bootlegger who she thought was either dead or in jail suddenly showed up in a cab and delivered her order of gin. And now she had too much alcohol and not room enough to store all this booze. So she asked her friend to cancel the gin order that she had. That was from 1924. So she was living in New York City at this time, and where, prohibition didn't really exist in that city. So kind of remarkable. My next book here, by the way, is a book about how Cather wrote that book, which she called her, quote, best book, 6 months before she died. And that book is about Death Comes for the Archbishop. I just turned the manuscript in on Monday to the University of New Mexico Press, and now goes on a peer review. And the book is going to be called The Bright Edges of the World, Willa Cather and Her Archbishop. And that should be out sometime probably later next year. We shall see how long the peer review process goes and so on. But very, very excited for this. I've been working on this book really since the idea came to me in 1998 when I first visited Santa Fe. And I thought this would be a great book to write. And here we are, nearly 3 decades later, and book should be out next year, I hope. So yeah, so come visit me in Santa Fe, come take the tour, and come see this amazing landscape that we have here. I think my very last slide here is just a quick little thank you for everyone, and we'll head on to Q&A here next. But my presentation here is based on two books that I published here. Back in 2011, I published Prohibition in Washington, D.C., slightly cheeky subtitle, How Dry We Weren't. And then in 2018, I wrote a book called The Great War in America, World War I and its aftermath. And I dealt then with how World War I was the occasion and of how the 18th Amendment was pushed through and all the super patriotism and so on. With that, I want to thank you so much for coming to my presentation. And look at that, we got about 12 minutes or so. And I'll stay on longer. As long as people want to stay on, I will answer every question. So don't worry about that. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Samuel is, I believe, teeing up the questions here for us.
Absolutely. Well, Garrett, thank you for this fascinating, interesting presentation. And we've already got some questions coming in. Again, if you have questions for Garrett, we can put those in the Q&A so I can pull them together. But right off the bat, one of the questions certainly I've considered listening to your talk and reading your book is about, we are the Capitol Historical Society. We love talking about the Capitol and Congress. And you talked about how bipartisan the effort to bring in prohibition was, and that this kind of shifted. Was there a time during that Prohibition era, when the 18th Amendment was in effect, that there was any kind of real wet, sort of out and proud, wet movement in favor of repeal in Congress? Was there sort of a drinkers' caucus of sorts that was open about it?
There was after the 1930 midterm election. Yeah, because at that point, the Wets got ousted. So you had the Great Depression going on. And then, of course, this, the story of Al Capone and then George Cassidy and whatnot, and all of the ostensibly dry, most of them got ousted. And so now there's this very solid wet majority that's running Congress. And it's still, I think the Democrats are controlling the House, but the Republicans still control the Senate for another 2 more years. And then the Dems seize control of the country. But even most of the Republican senators at that point are also wets. Yeah, it's remarkable how much public opinion changed on this. And that's what really led to the shift to ratify the 21st Amendment, because the people just saw it's not prohibiting anything. And it's just all these unintended consequences from prohibition.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and that actually tees up a couple of related questions. So I love that that's where you went with your answer. Still kind of focused in on Congress for a minute, and then we'll take it a little bit bigger picture. Folks are always interested, some of the inside baseball, some of the logistics perhaps of how did George Cassidy, the man in the green hat, how did he bootleg for Congress? Can you tell us a little bit more about his operation, a little bit more about how he brought alcohol to 80% of Congress?
Right? His is an incredible story, and those newspaper articles, he really spells it out. The only thing he does not do, he never names names. He never names any of the congressmen, but he does admit it's 80% of Congress drank. um, so the way it all got started was in 1920. He had earlier worked in a shoe factory as a kid. He had a third grade education, but he had incredible social skills. So everyone loved working with the guy. And one day he couldn't get his old job back for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And one day after he'd come back from the war, he'd fought in a tank battalion during World War I. And a friend of him asked, "Hey, I know a couple congressmen from the South, and they want to know, can you get them a couple bottles of booze?" And Cassidy said, "Yeah, I can do that." So he did, and of course, word got out that here's the guy who can like deliver. And so pretty soon he's got to make weekly runs up on basically we would call it today the Amtrak Northeastern line, right? Going up to and all the different stations along the way, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, New York City, all these different places he's got supply. He's got supply lane, and he's going up just with a suitcase. He'd fill up with alcohol and then haul it back. When he had some big orders, he'd get a couple friends with a couple different suitcases, and they would haul it all back. Really funny story. He said at one point where he dropped a suitcase one too hard, and one of the bottles shattered in there. And some guy passerby was like, "Mister, your suitcase is leaking." Wink, like.
Oh,
So, he never carried a gun. And he lived on Capitol Hill, so you'd get on the trolley and just go right to his office building. And back then, they only checked your suitcase or any of your materials on your way out of Congress. So he could walk right in, and the Capitol Hill police wouldn't search your bags or anything. So he could just haul the supply right to his office, where he had a lot stored right there. And then the congressmen also had this right not to be searched, so they could get their bottle of whatever hooch and leave the Capitol with it, and they wouldn't be searched. So, win-win, right? So that's how he got into the halls of Congress
sure,
for 10
absolutely.
years.
My goodness. Yeah, what a run. And then to,
Yeah, no metal detectors back then, right?
of course. Well, and actually, that's something, we've become here at the Historical Society something of experts on how security at the Capitol has evolved,
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that totally tracks with how
Yeah.
there were times when, the screening for visitors to Congress was a verbal question of, do you have
Yeah.
anything you should know? Okay, come on in. So,
Exactly. Really funny little side note. When I was 10, when I first visited DC in 1978, and we're right there in front of the Capitol building, which you could just walk into back then. And back then, the very front on the side facing the Supreme Court, taxis could drive right up. And we're getting out, and our congressman, Bob Matsui, who died now, Doris Matsui is taking this place. My dad, the two of them, we were friends. They were like, looked at each other and pointed simultaneously at each other and like, whoa. So we jumped out, we chatted with our congressman for a few minutes, and then he got us all hooked up with tickets and whatnot. But it was so funny. But that was the access back then, until 9/11. That changed everything.
of course, absolutely. Let's take a quick second. I want to do one more before we take a pause for our NPR moment, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of overtime since you've so graciously offered, because there are still a number of questions. We've still got a good number of folks here, but briefly, you talked about Cassidy didn't carry a gun, and he, had his sort of nice, clean, operation, except when he broke bottles by accident. But, like you talked about in your presentation, part of one of the big impacts of prohibition was this rise and real menace of organized crime. And there's a couple things we can get into with that. I would say let's start with one question we got about whether do you think organized crime, this gets a little speculative, so draw on your historian, we'll big asterisk for everyone on the call that this is, I'm asking Garrett to speculate a little bit, but do you think organized crime could have thrived as much as it did if there was not prohibition? Do you think they would have found another way, or was that really a linchpin for them?
I think it really was a linchpin for them. Yeah, I mean, Al Capone was already a known gangster, uh, but he was dealing in drugs and prostitution and the illegal gambling and that kind of stuff. And suddenly you see organized crime make this huge right shift and right into bootlegging because there's so much money to be made, and they're just heavily involved in it. And of course, you got New York City, Atlantic City, Detroit. That's a huge bed because it's right over the Canadian border. So that's where so much of the liquor comes in. It's just astonishing. It just rolled out the red carpet for them to make so much money. And that's it. It's money. That's
Sure.
it,
Absolutely.
Al Capone always said, because he loved talking with the press, I provide a public service. No one has to buy what I'm offering. People buy it because they want to buy it. And he was right, even though it's all illegal. But
Like you said, he understood some of that Econ 101, and he knew that where there's a
Mhm.
demand, he who controls the supply can control the market. Well, here
Exactly,
we
right?
are going to do a little bit more bonus round, but I'm going to ask Vincent to put up our upcoming events slide for a brief moment while I take a second to thank everyone for their ongoing support of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We always call this our NPR moment. We can only do this work. We keep the lights on. We pay our staff. We pay for the internet and the Zoom license and everything because of your generous support, your memberships, your contributions, your purchase of items from our merchandise department. And without that help, we wouldn't be able to bring these sorts of programs that we put on several times a month to you in the public. So we're grateful for that. We thank you for that. And we look forward to continuing to be a resource and an outlet for years and years to come. We've got a couple fun upcoming webinars that I want to bring to your attention. First, early June, we've got a book talk from a longtime Hill staffer, Mike Zamore, who has co-authored a bit of a political science, political history book on the filibuster. He wrote the book with his former boss and continuing friend, Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon. And so he's going to share with us what he's learned about the unique rule and procedure and challenge, perhaps, of the United States Senate, which is the filibuster. So we're going to have Mike Zamore in early June. And then a little bit later in June, we're excited to bring you some lived experience, something of a live oral history, if you will, with two of our favorite former members of Congress, former Congresswomen Ileana Ross-Leighton and Sherry Bustos, both of whom participated in the Congressional Women's Softball Game, a venerable Capitol Hill tradition. And they're going to tell us what that was like, what it was like putting that together, and something of the friendly rivalry between the women members of Congress who play against the women in the press. And so we've got both of those upcoming events. We're always adding more to our schedule. So please be sure to keep up with our newsletter and our website. You can scan that QR code if you have an interest in any of these events we've talked about. And I'll go ahead and thank Vincent for putting up that slide. And let's do a little bit more bonus round for those who are able to stick around with us for a few extra minutes. Let's talk for a minute about why I keep mispronouncing her name. Forgive me. Willa Cather. Cather. There we go.
Cather, yeah, who now
Cather.
has a statue in Statuary Hall, by the way, as of last
Exactly
June.
where I was going with that. So thanks for picking
Yeah.
right up there. So she now represents Nebraska as one of their two statues in the National Statuary Hall collection. If anyone gets over to the Capitol Visitor Center, you can see her right as you walk in. Um, can you tell us a little bit, this is sort of a tangent, but since you've been studying her life and her history, can you give us a little bit more about why she was worthy of a statue in the Capitol building, one of only 100 statues at maximum capacity from the 50 states?
Yeah, the states themselves choose who they want to be represented in there. So every state gets two people. Formerly, Nebraska had William Jennings Bryan, the great commoner, and I think over time he's sort of lessened his impact over history. Whereas Willa Cather, she lived a century ago, is still very relevant. People are still reading her. She's one of our most significant authors in American history. And so I think the citizens of Nebraska recognize that. It's like people think Nebraska is somehow déclassé. And Cather was like, no, there's interesting people and interesting stories wherever you go. And she made Nebraska almost single-handedly interesting through like My Antonia, through A Lost Lady, and of course, Oh Pioneers and Song of the Lark, and so on. So she heavily mined growing up in Red Cloud, Nebraska, population 1,000. So I'm going in there in a couple weeks to the Willa Cather Spring Conference. It's what the National Willa Cather Center is. It's a great facility. Laura Bush was on the committee that helped build this and renovate this large almost an entire city block, and it's a lot of fun. I went there last year for the first time, and just meeting all the other Cather people and discussing literature, and it's a blast. So come and join me in a Red Cloud sometime. It's a lot of fun. But she's a significant author, and I think over time, as time passes, like what's the canon of classic American literature? Oftentimes we decide that after the fact. I mean, the Great Gatsby, when it came out, kind of bombed. Scott Fitzgerald had other successful novels that we've largely forgotten about, but Gatsby, as it turns out, is the one that's really stood the test of time. And oftentimes we don't know that until later on as we assess history. And that's the case with Cather as well here. She was kind of forgotten about during the 70s, and revival began in the 80s. And today, of course, she's still considered to be one of the great American authors. And that's why the citizens of Nebraska were like, yeah, we're going to take out William Jennings Bryan and replace him with Willa Cather.
There we go. Well, we're certainly glad to have her here in the Capitol. Glad to have that touch
Too.
point for that uh, continuing view of history. Let's do a couple of rapid fire while we still have a couple of minutes here.
Sure.
There's one, this is perhaps a shot in the dark, but it's a fun question. There was a song, How Dry I Am,
Yes.
that came out in the Prohibition era. A, do you know anything about the song? And B, do you think it was something of a satirical parody type statement?
Yeah, I don't know the origin of the song itself, but it was very satirical because it's meant to be sung while you're drunk, right? So if you hear any versions of it, it's like how dry I am, and it's meant to point out that the person isn't dry at all, and alcohol is easy to get, and there's all this little subtext of that song,
Sure.
right?
Nice. Okay. I'm glad, we always love to turn to an expert and someone who's well read and well versed as it turns out. Let's hit one of the big questions that a lot of folks have raised this kind of question. I know we talked about it a little bit earlier. There are questions today in 21st century American life about effectiveness of prohibition, especially as various states have pursued legalizing marijuana.
Mhm.
And I know people often look to the Prohibition era as a lesson to be learned. Do you have any historical perspective you'd be willing to share and lend just to, as people think about situations today around them, around the country, all over the country, what
Yeah,
might
yeah,
you draw from your research?
yeah, absolutely. This is a question that comes up a lot when you discuss prohibition because people immediately draw the parallel to the war on drugs, which we've been fighting since Richard Nixon. Personally, I don't think the war on drugs is winnable, just because it's the same factors that prohibition led to, which is Econ 101. Um, there is a subset of Americans that want to use drugs. Uh, right now, of course, we're being, the Mexican cartels are flooding our market with fentanyl, and it's just horrible. I see it in Santa Fe. It's on the native reservations and so on, and of course, it's in downtown DC as well. It's just everywhere. It's almost impossible to stop because the pills are so small, and they're making hand over fist and money, and it's killing people. But they're making money, and there's that demand, so they're supplying it. That's always going to be there, I think. I don't think we're ever going to shut that down. Referring to cannabis, on the other hand, I think it's remarkable. And of course, the current administration just recently is requesting to reclassify cannabis from being, I think, currently a class 1 drug to a class 3. A lot of that goes back, I think, to the era of the Nixon administration, where okay, you had all those hippie protesters against the Vietnam War, and well, they were smoking dope, so therefore let's make it as something as bad as methamphetamine. And really, it's not. I mean, it's certainly cannabis has gotten a lot more potent. That's also the argument then for legalization. I live in New Mexico. We legalized a couple of years ago for recreational purposes itself. And hey, I don't particularly. I've been high. I will confess, I don't particularly like it. But I do think that hey, if you can go to a store and know what you're buying, then you can buy something that suits you rather than buying something off the street that may be laced with fentanyl or maybe coriander seeds or whatever. There is that caveat emptor. And that's what people were doing during Prohibition. They were buying bootleg liquor that was probably industrial alcohol that was then repurposed and then reflavored, etc. So, I mean, certainly, I think there is a national consensus emerging around legalizing cannabis. The federal government's always a few steps behind where the public is on this question. But I've seen the Gallup surveys on this. Most Americans, regardless if you're conservative or liberal, are in favor of legalizing it. So it's kind of fascinating to see this, building a consensus around it takes time and all, but
For sure. Well, I appreciate your thoughtful and historical perspective there. Let's hit a couple of little grab bag questions here, and then we'll yield back the rest of folks' afternoons. And I appreciate your willingness to share this time with us here. This
absolutely. I
extra.
appreciate people
Yeah.
staying on longer. Yeah.
It's great fun to talk. History nerds, we could geek out for hours on end. But
Absolutely.
one question that piqued my curiosity was. has to do a little bit with comparing different regions of the United States during this Prohibition era. And the correspondent asks why DC, well, let's back it up a step. Did DC have similar intensity of organized crime as some of the infamous New York, Chicago, syndicates, or some of the real, knockdown, drag out kind of, history that we're familiar with, Capone and the likes? Did DC have that kind of scene? And if not, do you think there was a reason DC didn't have that kind of a scene?
Yeah, DC never had that kind of scene. It's kind of interesting. So the bootlegging market was basically open to anyone who wanted to get involved in it. And so you had small different gangs that were involved in bootlegging. I think the largest one I found had about a dozen people in it. That was it. And that was a former police officer who knew how to get around the law. And yeah, it was kind of remarkable. He finally got caught toward the end of Prohibition. But basically, the market was open for everyone to participate in. We never had organized crime in DC. And I think that was also part of it right there. Whereas like in Chicago, you had both the Italian mafia and the Irish mob that were already organized beforehand. DC didn't have that. And on top of that, there was always the case of bribery, which was a huge component of prohibition. So bribing the police officers to look the other way, bribing the Prohibition Bureau agents. DC itself had this multiple layers of different law enforcement organizations. You just could not bribe everyone.
Sure.
Between the Metropolitan Police Department, the Capitol Hill Police, the Department of, sorry, what becomes the FBI, the Bureau of Investigation, and so on, the Secret Service. You've got all these different layers of law enforcement. And there's just no way you can bribe everyone. There isn't enough money.
For sure.
Yeah, it's just fascinating.
Absolutely.
Oh, also forgot the judges. You got to bribe them too.
Of course, naturally.
Yeah.
So that's great. That's helpful. That's interesting. And I just want to close with one question, perhaps fitting. It's a question about how, what came next. And so in particular, it's kind of a funny question from one correspondent. How did bootleggers make the transition? How did society make the transition when alcohol became legal again? Was there something of a movement for bootleggers to go legitimate? Was there some kind of, like collective, okay, that was bad, but now it's good, officially kind of transition? Can you speak to some of that, what that period looked like as the switch was flipped?
Yeah. The 1930s is really interesting to see that. Bootlegging does continue during that period, but gradually it tails off as consumers are more and more saying like, you know what, I'd rather just buy this from the store because I know what I'm buying. And so you do see a number of the bootlegging people go legit. Probably the most famous example is actually in Canada, but the Bronfman family, who found the liquor company Seagram's. You might recognize that name. They go legit. And, the grandfather of Bronfman, he was a huge bootlegger into the United States, largely through Detroit, but from Ontario province. So, but he decides, hey, I've got a good business model here. Let's keep it, and, the family's still around. I've met some of them. It's pretty cool. They're heavily involved in philanthropy now today and stuff. So,
My goodness. Well,
yeah.
Garrett Peck, thank you so much for taking the time today to share this fascinating chapter of history, carry forward our exploration of the constitutional amendments. We're grateful for your time, and to everyone listening today, watching today. We're grateful that you've taken this time with us as we continue this exploration. We look forward to having you with us as we carry on through number 27. We're going to cover them all.